All right. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome back if you've been with us in earlier sessions of the conference. Well, my name is Margin. I'm NARA president, and I yeah there. Thank you for coming to this session. We're going to hear Akilah S. Richards give a presentation called of a Birth of a Postcolonial Perspective on Parenting, which is based on her recently published book, Raising Free People, Unschooling as Liberation and Healing Work. And so Akilah is also a podcaster on Unschooling. Her podcast is They're the Free Child, and she is also a parent of two children who are unschooled, and one of them we heard yesterday in our panel on self-directed education. So yes, Akilah.
Yes. Thank you, Margin. Peace, y'all. I am so happy to be here. Yesterday was a rough day, and I was very much looking forward to this space here today to talk about something that I think is such a significant part of the opportunity we have right now, the opportunity to heal, the opportunity to come together, and the opportunity to create a change that we've all known was needed for a very long time, but we can really start to see how it can happen. So I'm going to take a cue from my brother online. He's Only Black Cosmonaut, and on his podcast he talks about taking a few deep breaths with everybody in a room together, especially in a virtual space. So I'm going to invite you to do that if that might feel good. Let's just take 3 good deep breaths to center ourselves and just be here together. All right. So I am in Atlanta, Georgia, USA at the moment. So I want absolutely to honor the Muscogee Creek Nation people whose land this is, and also my ancestors and their role and contributions to this land. Margin, Naira, the entire Youth Rights Association team, volunteers for doing this. Margin and I were just talking a little before about how event planning can be a whole lot. And right now, everything is a whole lot. So the fact that, they saw fit to put this together now, because it is so urgent and important, I really honor that, and I'm happy to be here. So I see this as an invitation to agitate. That's what I see this as an adult, as a youth advocate. I see this as an opportunity to agitate. I see this as an opportunity to remind, to call in, to speak up, to disrupt, and to really talk about education and sovereignty outside of the confines of a school-centric mindset. So that's what I want to offer and bring in for the time that we'll have together. And I want you to be comfortable, not in terms of mindset. Hopefully there's some disruption going on, but I want you to be as comfortable as you can and as open as you can. So camera on or off, doesn't matter to me, whatever feels good to you. It is not distracting to me if you have it on sometimes and then off, no problem. There will be time for your questions towards the middle-ish and then a little bit again towards the end, because I'd like for it to be a discussion. So as I'm talking and I'm going to make room for questions, you can just unmute yourself when I invite that. Otherwise, please stay muted so that background noises, don't get in the way. Y'all know the Zoom lingo probably, right? Since this is our life right now. And also when we do answer and ask questions, keep in mind that we don't have a lot of time together. So don't be asking no 20-minute questions, okay? So try to keep it succinct where you can. It doesn't need to be well worded. It just can't be long, okay? So as Margin mentioned, what I want to talk about, I called it Birth of a Postcolonial Perspective on Parenting. And to clarify, colonial how I understand it and use it in this instance is about the idea of a sovereign space that a group of people come to and decide that they're going to take over that space without the permission, usually from a space that includes violence as a means of control. And the intention of the colonizer is to make the space somehow better, to enhance it, to make it beneficial to everyone, including the person who's making the decision about what beneficial means. That's what I understand when I say colonial. So post-colonial, I mean on the other side of that. Not perfectly, not completely getting it all the way right all the time, but when I say post-colonial, I'm talking about acknowledging my colonizer-minded behaviors as an adult, as a parent, accepting responsibility for that, and then developing and designing and inviting practices for shifting over into more liberatory partnership-centered relationships with all young people, including the ones that I have the most power over, which are my children. So I know that there's some familiar faces here. I see Lou, I see Bria, I see familiar names as well. But in case my work is new to you, I'm going to take a moment to talk a little bit about my what and why, because I think it will lead into this. And then I want to hear a little bit from you too about why you're here at this conference and why you're here at this particular talk. So essentially, my daughters, who are now 16 and 14, and Marley, as Marjan mentioned, was on a panel yesterday, recently involved with Naira, and I'm really excited about that. Marley and Sage were in public school when they were littles, and they resisted. They pushed back against it. They would say that they were uncomfortable. I talk a lot more in detail about it in my book, called Raising Free People, about some of the things that were happening that led my partner Chris and me to say, oh, maybe when it comes to the girls and their education, it is more than just about getting them into the best school that we can afford to get them into. There are other things at play here that are just as important. Them being in school is really when that really started to happen, because like most families, particularly for us, as Chris and I are both Jamaicans, we moved to the US as children, so our parents migrated, and we were very much of the mindset that it was a part of our responsibility to create a different future, a different trajectory for our family than the ones that our parents had, as a result of the oppression that they dealt with in Jamaica, a lot of political uprising and all of that. And so Chris and I did the good studenthood thing. We did good in school. We went to college. We left, we got married, had the kids, and did the checklist things, and lived in a white neighborhood with a good school, did all of those things. And after some time, Marley, who's our oldest, was just pushing back. She was doing really well academically. She got labeled gifted and talented. We were going through all of the things with the school board in terms of trying to develop a curriculum that met Marley's academic needs. All of those things, they were testing her all the time. We found out they were testing her even without our permission. So they were doing other testing on top of the testing we said yes to. She was missing recess, which was a really big deal to her. And then after a while, so she was pushing back against those things that were happening for her. And Chris and I were pushing back against her pushback, saying, look, this is what this is all about. You're doing well in school. They see that you're smart. This is the path. You're going to get to college. You're going to get to do whatever you want in life. You won't have to struggle like Daddy and I do or did, or what, all the things that sound right and responsible. But after she continued to push, and then Sage got into school and a very similar thing happened, and she pushed for very different reasons, Chris and I decided that at some point, being extensions of the school system in terms of making sure Marley and Sage just continued to fit into it and acclimate themselves, we realized that was probably, we weren't sure, but it was probably dangerous, because it meant that Marley and Sage couldn't trust us to honor and advocate for their needs. So, so like that came up for us. And it was the very first time that we recognized that maybe there was some discord between being advocates for the school system so that our children could thrive, and advocates of Marley and Sage so that we could be trustworthy adults for them. And as we started to recognize that and be with that and question that, it became less and less possible for us to honor both, because we started to see that inherent in a lot of the what I now call schoolishness, what we need to do to acclimate and contort our children and ourselves into school culture. A lot of those things were tools of oppression. They were about control. They were about assimilation. They were about groupthink. They were about idea of democracy in a way that is not cool for me. So we eventually said there was too much dissonance to try to continue doing both. So we said we would withdraw them from school, break them out of school prison, and then see what we could do from there. And maybe if it didn't work, we would just re-enroll them and try something else. That's where our journey started. Then we did that, and then we went from school to school at home to becoming better listeners of Marley and Sage and seeing that learning was not this thing that you simulated in a classroom, and that it could potentially be enhanced in a classroom setting, for sure. But that it often got in the way, like our idea of learning actually got in the way of what Marley and Sage were doing, and also how they were trying to educate us about what it meant to support them. That is how my partner Chris and I began this journey of being partners and not like parenting authoritative, smart adults who could make sure our children turned out good in life. So that's kind of where we started. And we continued down that path until about a year or so into school at home, we recognized schoolishness and began our deschooling, and then transitioned into unschooling, which is really more about seeing what our children were already into, recognizing how we tended to get in the way of it with our idea of what learning meant, and instead learning how to follow their lead and develop a language together for how to be with them, for them to be with us, to honor boundaries, all these skills that really we use all the time. These are not just skills for adults and children, these are human skills. I'm about to be 43 this year, and I'm still developing an understanding of, for example, my own boundaries and how to speak up for those boundaries and honor other people's boundaries without it being combative. Because my schoolish upbringing says I gotta push for a boundary, and I gotta force, and I gotta shine, and I gotta stand above someone else so that the people in power see me and honor me, and then my boundary is created and other people go honor that because my teacher said, or whoever, my professor, whoever. Like, those were the norms. That was the language and practice that I was used to. But Marley and Sage did not need that. And not only did they not need that, that was actually intrusive. It interrupted their process. And so I keep talking now about my friend Bio, who also wrote the foreword for my book. And I was on a thing with him and a few others the other day about sanctuary for the child and sanctuary for the parent. And him and this sister named Adela, they were both talking about, when it came to parenting, remembering, right? And not in the sense of cognitive, but quite literally remembering, putting back the pieces of oneself or of a thing in order for that thing to be whole, and in order for that whole to be recognized, that WHOLE to be recognized. And oftentimes when it comes to young people and their rights, because we are all so schoolish, we do not honor the whole. They are not fully membered. We take the parts of them, we take academic and we say, this is king, this is it. if you are thriving in school, that was my whole shtick. Like, I learned that my parents, the currency was academics. So it didn't even matter all the craziness I was doing over here. If I got straight A's, and if I was reading the announcements in school, and if I was vice president of student government and captain of the cheerleading squad, not because of cheerleading, but because it looked good on my, my record to say that I was doing extracurricular. If I did all of those things, you know how much other stuff I could be doing low key, which I did. Because, and it wasn't because my parents, particularly my mother, who was our primary caregiver, it wasn't because my mother wasn't present and loving and available and busy and good, right? It was because that schoolish mindset is the dominant thing. It's not about the actual child. I was not trustworthy in that sense. She didn't know that, because I was trustworthy in the school sense. And what that also meant is that there were other needs that I had in terms of the emotional part of who I was, in terms of, again, the social element, the boundaries, all those things were not being served. They were being reacted to. But what was really my currency was academics. And it turns out that so much of my own remembering, so much of my own personal leadership, my confident autonomy, and my capacity to support that in Marley and Sage is tied to my unlearning, my deschooling, not the things I learned in school. It's tied to the rights that I didn't get a chance to cultivate as a child, because the adults around me did not even think about childhood in terms of rights, not because they were not good, right? And that's what I want to go into a little bit. I want to pause here for a second, because I want to go into now some of the things from that chapter in my book, in my own life experiences, about the ways that Blackness for me and intersectional feminism and some of the other parts of my identity help to inform how I now see and advocate for youth rights. But I want to pause for a moment to invite a little bit of your voice. Can you share with me, just unmute yourself and share with all of us what's present for you? What are you hearing? Why are you here? How does this so far resonate with you? If anybody is called to do that, please do. All right, we're good. And no problem if no one is. Oh, and I see September. Good. Peace. Um, yeah, so I'm going to move a little bit then into some of the things that show up for me and shore up my practice. Because the umbrella that I put the work that I do under is called Raising Free People Work. And it includes myself, because I am also decolonizing and learning a lot of things. And I recognize that so much of what I thought was really about education, in terms of my child's right to learn how both of my daughters identify how both of them want to learn. It is so much more than that. It is not just about their right to learn. It's about their right to show up as themselves, to sound how they want to sound. It's about confident autonomy, right? And by confident autonomy, what I mean is the capacity to lead oneself in a way that is not harmful to people in community, and in a way that understands how to be in community, that what it actually means to be liberated. Because one of the things that I'm learning in these spaces is that oftentimes our perception of liberation or freedom, and why we are afraid to back up and make that room for young people to be free and to teach us about freedom, is because we understand freedom from what I call a pervasive whiteness perspective, which is a freedom that means, in order for me to be free and happy, someone else has to be smaller, someone else has to die, someone else has to conform, someone else has to be a way that I understand and can explain, otherwise it's not okay. That's not what freedom means. That's not what liberation is. Freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. You can't be free. The place is not free. Liberation is not present if people are being harmed by your liberation, whether you mean to do it or not. And as adults, that's a lot of what we do. Our idea of liberation for ourselves and our children and the planet is not informed by the perspectives of the very same people and beings that we're saying we're fighting for this freedom for. And that's schoolish, and that's also pervasive whiteness. That's where that comes from. So I want to talk a little bit about how that shows up for me, and again, invite people to come in and as we take another break, say, oh, because the O's are good, because then other people can hear bits of their story. And that's how we invite change, because I don't want to just get hype, y'all. I want us to really use this where we can, right? Lewis feeling me. I don't want to just get hype. I want to invite change. So in that chapter, I first talk about hitting my children. I talk about how, as someone who grew up under the influence of British Caribbean perspective on authority and parenting, that hitting Marley or Sage, pinching them, slapping, popping them, as we say, to give the term less harmful implications, that was a normal for me. And not only was it normal, it was responsible, particularly as a Black parent, because my children did not have the luxury of just being in the street, being themselves. And so I needed to be really assertive about making sure that they knew how to behave, essentially that they knew how to perform for whiteness. The same way my mother did when we moved to the country, because she was living in the US before we were. And when we moved, I remember the first time we went to the bank, and it was like we were in church or something, like we had to show up differently. Meanwhile, I saw a little white boy who didn't have shoes on running all over the place, and the bank teller gave him a lollipop. Meanwhile, my mother seemed so nervous, and she wasn't even like applying for a job at the bank. Like her money was in the bank, and yet her children needed to perform in order for it to feel safe for her in that moment. That's how we grew up, even in Jamaica, with a majority Black population. Colonization, just like how it shows up in parenting, it doesn't care. It doesn't care what you look like or where you come from or whatever. It is pervasive. And even in a Black body, you can embody it because it's the waters that we swim in. So the first thing that I talk about is how I met this woman named Toya when I was on the Steve Harvey show. And it was a panel about parents, like new age parenting, which is what they were calling unschooling, and regular ass oppressive parenting, whatever they were calling that, right? And they were saying, and Toya was saying that, she attacked her son, and she did it because if she didn't do that, the police could kill him because he had skipped school and was at a protest for another, Black body that was lynched. And listening to Toya, even though she and I were not even on the same page about pretty much everything, listening to her and her telling her story with such honesty was such a lesson for me. I'm so grateful for her willingness to share that reality, because she and I had a lot more in common than I even recognized. I was doing the same thing. I was just not on camera. And maybe mine wasn't aggressive in the same way, so I could tell myself, well, I did just pop her. Or when she told a lie, I slapped her then because, come on, it was a lie. Toya helped me to recognize how she and I were doing the same colonizer-minded thing, which was to try to keep our Black babies safe by doing a lighter version of the irreversible thing that the system could do to them. And then being with that enough to recognize that and say, and that is not okay. It is not okay that my rationale and my intention supersedes the reality of the violence and harm that Marley and Sage experienced at my hand for whatever my reason is. Because that is about their right to be safe before we even get to the relationship between them and me that I want them to have and me to have with them and their dad and all the stuff that's about me. Before we even get there, is this human being, Marley, Sage, whoever, their right to be safe, particularly at home, their right for their bodies to be theirs and for it to not be violated by anyone, especially somebody who claimed to love them and somebody who trusts them and somebody who they wanted to trust, right? All those things started to come up. And then I started to recognize, oh, this shit is about power. It isn't, it's about decolonizing my idea of power, because what I was operating under was the guise that I had the power to keep Marley and Sage safe by any means necessary. When really, as I began to deschool and look at how to decolonize my parenting practice little by little, because that's where it started for me, then I recognized, oh, so if I'm talking about power and not just equating the power to myself, then where is Marley and Sage's power in the conversation about their rights? If they do something wrong, like a lie or whatever, not even, let's remove the quotes, if they do some shit that I think is wrong, how then do we both stand in our power and have the thing addressed? Is that even possible? Right? These are the things that I started to question. That's why I talk about mad question asking. Like when you start to feel and make a connection between the dissonance of power and the right of a child in comparison to like what you think needs to be done in the moment, sometimes we don't have an answer, but we can question something. And that question gives us an opportunity to disrupt the behavior, the pattern of colonization that we're used to. So sometimes all we need are a set of questions, and I have them for myself. I also have a lot of them in the book, questions that we can ask ourselves to be like, wait a minute, what am I responding to right here? I'm responding to a power situation. I'm responding to my fear. I'm weaponizing my fear right now and like straight up stabbing my kids with it because I don't know what else to do with it. That's what I'm doing. And I remember as an adult, I remember actually as an adult, I remember when those sort of things happened to me as a child. All of us can. All of us can. And that's what I encourage us to remember, to put ourselves back together as we talk about this. Because another thing that I mentioned in the book is that when I was 14 and living in South Florida, I was attacked by a police officer, slammed against the hood of his police car. And thankfully, my friend, Vinny, his big brother, who was probably like 17 at the time, who was walking us home from the dance, Vance put his life at risk to be like, yo, what you do? Like basically to stand up to the cop for the cop to, ease up enough to lean me up off the hood of his car. And how when I got home, I was like 105 pounds, big white cop, right? Just him and like 5 of us, 14, and then Vance, Vinny's big brother. And I remember when I got home, and it was nighttime by the time I got home, and I told my mother, she's a single mother, and just me and my 2 younger brothers, and it seemed like she was mad at me. It seemed like my mom was mad at me, and I'm like, wait, what? She asked me if I got his badge number. She asked me these things that I now understand. And at the time, I was just too frazzled to even get any of that. And over time, way into adulthood, I began to recognize that, oh, this woman, my mother's name is Valerie. Valerie looked at power in that moment. And she saw and recognized and felt and was infuriated by the reality that she did not have any power as she saw it in that moment as a Black immigrant woman raising these 3 Black children in this place where white police officers could say or do whatever they wanted, and all we could do was try to be safe. Even if we were living in a predominantly Black, predominantly Jamaican like us, we could be there and we were represented, but we did not feel like we belonged. And that same feeling is what a lot of young people deal with right now, wherever they are. We are here, we're represented, people smile at us and say wonderful things, but we do not feel like we belong because our power is not recognized. So those sort of parallels are what y'all got me to the space of recognizing that this was not about Marley and Sage and education. This was about power. It was about privilege. It was about the pervasiveness of the myth of white supremacy and how that informed my own parenting practices and my own relationship practices. Um, and my responsibility to start doing something different, right? To start imagining the same way that I began to imagine beyond the classroom setting for Marley and Sage with no idea of what that might look like. I don't know. I mean, we were really schoolish. We still, even when we took them out of school, we were still like, okay, bet. You can learn about science and stuff through other things, but also here's your book because we don't know, we don't understand. So it just took us the time and those sort of parallels, like the one I just mentioned, um, to start to think about our relationships with young people as being more about a thing on privilege and power than it was about education or anything else. You know, it wasn't about those things. So as we began to deschool and Marley and Sage started to trust Chris and me a little more, that's when education really started happening for Chris and me. And Marley and Sage just like took off in terms of learning, whether it was like language or a type of artistry or um, like the intellectual rigor of debate because you weren't afraid that somebody was going to slap you if they disagreed with you. Basic human rights, essentially, that they could trust were in the room and that their parents were going to advocate, and that little things like bodily autonomy, you know, little things like y'all, and if anybody here is like a Caribbean person, our Black folks in general, we do this. When somebody comes over to visit, your adult friend comes over to visit, or a family member, that child needs to be present, right? They can't just be locked up in their room because it's rude. Like, hey, you know, my friend's here, come say hi. Like little things like that that feel like it's just politeness, where it's like, why? They're not even here for them. They did not even ask for them to be here. What is this actually about? I'm like presenting my children like I present my plants, like I made sure to put my plants all in a picture. You know, like I was treating human beings like that. And it was normalized and is normalized. And that's absurd. And that is a form of violence. And no wonder they wouldn't trust me to say what is present for them. So we started to deschool and advocate and to say, you ain't got to come out the room unless you ask for this person to come over, right? You do not need to hug these people because that is what they are accustomed to. You did all of these different things. You can speak up for yourself, or if you don't want to or you're uncomfortable, I am happy to do this in that moment. These little things that never occurred to me at all. They just didn't until Marley and Sage had the opportunity to be themselves a little bit more and more, and for Chris and me to learn how to be a little more trustworthy. That is when those things emerged. So I'm saying that to say, you don't need to like have all of the knowledge in advance, and you don't need to attend 20 more of these before you start treating young people like human beings with rights, and before you start listening to what it is that, look, the biggest lesson for me is that I don't need to know in advance in order to do better. That's a schoolish mindset right there, right? That I need to have the right answer before I move forward. When I am fully equipped, when I've taken the right amount of things, read the right books, then Marley and Sage will be free. What? Like right now with the uprisings, are we going to wait for, come on, y'all, another president? Are we going to wait for, no, there are many things that we can and should be doing right now, like this, like what Naira put together, so we can figure out how to be in community together, right? So we can talk about and listen to the ways that these things we think are like, whoa, is anybody else having this problem? How could I even come up with a 3-step solution? Meanwhile, Margin and the crew was already on that. They already been in practice about these things, right? I mean, there's so many things that Marley and Sage's groups, the people that they're involved with, many of them that are their age ranges, the level of nuance that they understand, and not only understand, but are resolving things through, You understand the ecosystems that they have in place to resolve conflict and to work through anything from travel issues to predators online. They have developed so many solutions to things that so many of us as adults sit in and pontificate in and write in, and in college getting a second and third degree about, when all we really need to do is learn how to be in community with young people without being a threat to like their basic rights and safety, so that we can learn how to together better, because a lot of those things are already happening. They're already happening. The idea that we as adults need to know first and then come into a space with that knowing is a part of the problem. It's a part of the problem. And that's why when I talk about a post-colonial perspective on parenting, which is really, it's not just parenting, it's adult child, it's intergenerational relationships. When we say post-colonial, we say, how do we rehumanize our relationships? How do we go from the hierarchy of me being alive longer and feeling like I know more? How do I move that out of the way of our capacity to be together so that I can know how to listen, so that I can know how to partner, which means that leadership is like this, not like this, right? Everybody is leading at some point. We have ecologies in place. What does that look like? And oftentimes young people are already doing that. They are already doing that. And it's not for us to give young people the right to whatever. A lot of it is just getting out of the way, learning how to listen so that we can get in the mix of what is already happening and learn how to have a valuable place in that, a place that is valuable for the whole as it is being remembered, and not just a place where we have this colonizer perspective where we're looking over and being like, man, September, if I could just get a hold of you and teach you the right things, you would make such a wonderful such and such when you're grown. Imagine if somebody said that to you as a grown-up, Kate. If somebody's like, Kate, I know you grown, but you have so much potential. And if I could just make sure that you wear blue because it's a better color for you, honey, I promise. And if you could just let me tell you these things because I care about you. I know, you have thoughts too. Bet, jot that down. We'll talk about that at the end, right? Like because it's absurd, right? I see the laughter. I also see some very serious faces. It is absurd, but it is also our normal pattern. So when I talk about raising free people, I'm talking about rising up out of the idea that intergenerational relationships are one where adults can figure out how to be more useful to these adults becoming. We transition out of that into something very different. It's collaborative. It is intersectional. It invites clarity and celebrates diversity. You know, as my friend Genesis says all the time, diversity is sacred, sacred. But we're always looking for this sameness because we're all so schoolish and we want to standardize the bejesus out of everything. Because that's then we can make it make sense and we can say it succinctly and we can school it up. And that is to the detriment of our relationships. It is violent. It makes us adults ill-equipped. Like, look where we took the planet. Look where we took government. Like, this is us as adults. Do we have it down? Right? So I want to take a moment because I see the chat is popping. I'm going to read this quote. If you have come to help me, oh, yes, you're wasting your time, but if you're here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Yes, Queensland Aboriginal activist, 1970. Thank you, Richard, for that. Y'all check out the chat. Absolutely. So when we talk about being in community, when we talk about togethering, when we talk about liberation, we cannot like give children freedom. We do not raise them outside of ourselves. The raising is collective. They are raising us. We are raising them. they and we is all the same. Everything is everything, as we say back home. It's all this one thing. So I feel like when we talk about the charge as adults, the charge is not even about developing a thing, it's listening more deeply. It is understanding how we as adults tend to try to translate what young people are saying, so that whatever the so that is, as opposed to listening and allowing for, you know, the iterations to happen, and for us to learn what it means to be in partnership in a way that doesn't center control and violence. This is really our work. This is a lot of our work. So pause point once again to invite anyone to unmute, to bring anything that is present for them. I'm gonna pause for a moment.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
I'll just comment on what Akilah said on the quote. I think you addressed that quote beautifully. Thank you.
You're welcome, Richard. Okay, and who was that, Sebastian?
Yes.
Okay.
So I really liked the things that you said about like freedom and liberation. I had a question. So right now I'm in a graduate program that is all about like decolonizing children's experiences and you know, questioning like with these white norms. But at the same time, they're very afraid of freedom and liberation language. Like if you ever say freedom or liberation around them, they kind of, you know, they kind of like tighten up in their chairs. And so I was wondering how you would respond to someone who hears the word freedom and they immediately think like, you know, Enlightenment colonialism. They immediately think about like how the United States used the ideal of freedom to like justify the slave system, and they don't
Yes.
think these actually emancipatory projects.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you for that question, Sebastian. I really love to get into that, because the work of decolonizing starts the minute you decide to do it, before you pick up a thing, before you study a thing. So it starts with the questioning of the things. So when we talk about liberation and freedom, it is scary to a lot of groups of people. It, particularly when we think about children, they think of, I'd like to liken it to the Lord of the Flies idea. And as you said, also the idea that freedom has been used to justify a lot of the extreme opposite of what that is. So the first thing is to decolonize the notion of freedom, because to take that and to only equate it to what a system, a people, America in particular, its pattern of colonization and violence, to diminish the definition of it too, that is an act of colonialism, right? So that's the first thing that I would say. Language, word is power. So the first thing is to start to look at the word and say, I understand. I totally understand connotatively, like why you would see it like that. The context of it in this system is as such, but let me bring you to something else. Let me hip you to a definition that sits outside of that. And again, to also make sure that we bring back the word responsibility into talk about liberation and freedom, because it is not freedom if it is violence, right? Now, getting to freedom may include violence. These are layers. So that's what I would say, Sebastian, to invite the conversation around decolonizing the very notion of it. And a part of that decolonization is to include the responsibility that comes with it, right? To reject the very notion that liberation and violence against a group of people as a result of people's liberation, a group of people who did not incite or invite that by their practices, to reframe that knowing. Also, and I'm going to look in the chat too, because I think a few people might have addressed it. Good. Okay. Bria put in another article about decolonization. And then John said, what would they consider a better alternative? That's what, thank you, John, because that's exactly where I was going to go. Question it, mad question asking, say, okay, bet. So what might that look like differently? And not because you want to be like, oh, tear that down, tear that down, tear that down, tear that down. No, because again, we're decolonizing this thing, right? So that you can hear where they are, and that you can kind of show where that's coming from, you know, like with hitting and going back to the idea, talk about in the book how a woman said to me that that comes from a slave master mindset, you know, of breaking a person, and how that shit rocked my everything, right? And I didn't even know if I believed her, but it rocked me enough for me to go down that path. So sometimes, Sebastian, as we're in these spaces, the goal doesn't need to be, and I'm not saying you were trying to change their minds, but oftentimes we want to be like, dude, that's not even what it's about, let me tell you. But instead, to just decolonize even that practice and say, all right, bet, where you at? Let me show you where I'm at. And let's just be together, you know, in the room with the feelings, and watch how people are going to be like, what? You know, or not, but you're bringing a different thing into the space. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Good. You're welcome. Anybody else, whether it's about that or anything else? Okay. All right. It's 2:51. My timer. We're on till 3:30. I'm gonna request and offer a 5-minute bio break. All right. So bathroom, whatever, and I will be back on at 2:56. Okay.
Would you all like to see my cat?
Yes. Oh, why the cone?
He's a very sad kitty. Oh, he has a wound on his ear. I don't know if it's going to show up on the camera well. But yeah, he has a wound on his ear.
Oh,
So he has to wear the cone.
Seems to be
He's
putting
like,
up
why are
with it
you
well.
holding me up to your camera? Because I must show my cat to everyone, Andy. You're too cute not to.
My cat does not let me do that. I pick him up and he like scrambles for his life. Everything is scary to him.
Yes, me awkwardly showing my cat off the sides.
All right. I am back, and I hope everybody else is too. So I want to, I'm going to read a little section from that same chapter, chapter 5 in the book, and invite some conversation around it. Excuse me. I want to make sure that, once again, I have this anxiety around hype and no change, really, to be transparent, because I know that I sometimes do that, like how the work moves through me and how I show up in a space. It could be like, yeah, but then, but then what do we do about it, right? I want to feel as much as I can feel, like after this conversation, there is something that each of us can take away that's going to bring us a little bit closer to the types of relationships that we want to be in with the young people in our lives and in the world, right? So I'm offering this because it's a different medium in terms of not me here being present in the space and sharing, but something that I've thought about, something that I wrote back in 2016. That's connected to this. Okay, so I'm going to read that and invite a little bit of questions or a little bit more dialogue. So let's see. So this was after the section where I talked about the Broward County police officer situation and how my mom was angry and how I didn't understand it then and I understand it now. And how I was connecting that to other types of violence that were happening to other bodies and blah, blah, blah. So I began to reframe parenting, and this is when I began seeing and proclaiming my parenting as part of my intersectional feminist practices. In June of 2016, I wrote a piece about intersectional feminist parenting. It was published on ravishly.com, and I'm going to read a little piece of the excerpt. My beliefs about people's rights, including my own, are a significant factor in how I determine or how I define myself, how I identify, and how I treat other people. And since I am in fact raising people, my approach to parenting must reflect those beliefs too. Otherwise, I risk robbing my daughters of the same sense of personal agency and social responsibility that I believe promotes more confidence and compassion among people in the world. Our society treats children as a group that cannot be trusted and that needs to be guided, usually through punishment, physical violence, forced education, and little to no input on how they spend the majority of their time. I disagree wholeheartedly, and I don't want to perpetuate that narrative. Essentially, I see intersectional feminist parenting as a solution to the lack of spaces where young people can build confident autonomy in all aspects of their lives, even when their choices and lifestyle go against the beliefs, power, and inherent privilege of the adults in their lives. I'm talking about resisting the power and privilege of adulthood over youth, which some people call adultism or childism. Parents who identify as feminist or as supporters of feminist parenting have different means of applying this idea to their everyday choices. The life topics are pretty similar: body positivity and autonomy, open communication, embracing diversity, practicing compassion, respecting oneself and others, doing away with gender-based roles, and embodying confident self-expression. And then I go on to talk about starting my podcast in that same year as a result of Black parents in particular reaching out about the sense of fear around freedom. Like Sebastian was talking about one group's context of freedom. There are many different contexts of freedom, and they're often rooted in like what someone survived to get free, and not necessarily what freedom might look like if that person could imagine outside of the thing they survived, right? There's a parallel with that, y'all, in schooling. There's a parallel with that, y'all, in government. Like, there's a parallel with that, y'all, in police. You see this? You see this? There's so many of the ways that because of the colonized mindset, we cannot imagine when people say divest from the police, whether we agree with it or not, which I do, but whether we agree with it or not, oftentimes we can't even imagine outside of that. not because we are not capable of collaborating and governing, but because that thing, that powerful thing, feels like all we know. And it feels like to operate outside of it is too dangerous, too scary, too much at risk. Let's just elect another person. Let's just try to be focus on the nice police officers. Let's just try to make our kids really great students. Let's just try to get the people to speak better English so we can understand them. All of these things are connected, all of them. Everything is everything. And that is why unschooling, the principles around that and the overarching self-directedness, for me and for a lot of the folks, particularly Black, non-Black, Indigenous, and people of color folks in the communities that I'm either part of or invited into, that is why the principles of unschooling are liberatory practice for us, because they connect to all of the other ways that we identify with, perpetuate, in some instances are victimized by all of these social injustices or situations. We get a chance now to see why we uphold them, how they play into power, our role in that, our responsibility for that, and then some of the things we can do collectively in our own psyches, in our own bodies. Margin and I were talking a little bit before this call about, moving into our bodies, how somatics right now, I'm so grateful for the ways that we are getting back into what I know as a lot of African centeredness, where we are talking about the whole person and the person's connection to nature and self is nature, and body, and knowing that we can start to move away from a child being considered smart or valuable because they are articulate, but more because they exist and are, and us being curious about the brilliance in them that we're not able to see because of our schoolishness, or the way we label some things brilliant because of schoolishness. Marley gets that all the time when we talk about it. Oh, you're so well spoken. You're so right. Are you listening to the thing that I'm saying? Or if someone else who's telling you something that you need to know is saying it, but they have a different accent, or are you listening? Because that's how I gauge whether you're intelligent, not whether you are calling me intelligent, but you're right. So these are things that, again, if it was not for the young people in my life, primarily my children, y'all, I'd definitely be an attorney, because that's the path I was on. Probably would have got a whole bunch of schooling, which is not a problem unless you do it without a knowledge of self, which most of us do. And then we recover from schooling with a whole lot of debt instead of it building us up, right? Like, I'm learning so much from just being in relationships with young people. And I did a lot of schooling. And none of that was really where I got the language and practice that's helping me to not be oppressive to my children, and to do things like this where people are listening, where we can have a group of people who are in academia, whether it's at a professorship level or they're in school, or we have people who don't care nothing about academia and didn't even finish high school or middle school, and don't view people by their grades. That's another big revolution we're in the middle of right now, moving away from calling somebody a whatever grader and calling them by something else, something they actually can identify with in their personhood, as opposed to like their situation in school. These are some of the decolonization things that we can do with simply just language. Don't ask me what grade my kid would be in. I don't know. What does that have to do with anything? Right? Unless that's actually where they are and how they want to identify in that moment. Little big things, tiny mighty things, because the language is what keeps us indoctrinated to begin with. As adults, we meet each other and we're like, oh, what do you do? Right? And as a young person, what are you learning? What are you studying? What grade are you in? Dude, what does that even have to do with who that person is? So I try to start with even little things like, what are you into? Or as adults, I say, do not ever ask your child what they learned today. Don't do it. We're not ready. We can't handle that question yet. We're not there yet. Maybe a few years from now. Because right now, it is an invitation to schoolishness. I remember Sage talks all the time about how she would be nervous to tell me when she was interested in something before I became a trustworthy adult, because then I would just be like, Dinosaurs? We about to be about this dinosaur life. We are about to go to this museum. We're about to get these books. We're about to, and it's like, I just said I was into dinosaurs, and really, I like the shape of their teeth. Really, that's more about architecture. I would have never gotten that. That actually happened. It wasn't the teeth and the architecture, but it was some other stuff that, in all my schoolishness and all my certifications, I did not figure out because I wasn't listening. I took a thing and I was about to go in and do my colonizer thing and be like, yes, sovereign land, let me come in and make you better, enrich you with my knowledge and my access to all things dinosaur. When really what that's doing is getting in the way of a very organic practice that's going to lead you to far more. And if I'm in a position to listen and facilitate, then I can bring in the Wi-Fi and the car drive to the place and the dollars for the thing and whatever. That is responsible partnership, not the other way around, where we as parents in our schoolish mind say, well, I'm going to make sure you have all the things you need, whether you like that shit or not. That is the same thing we do to other people in various ways. That accent will go. I remember being so excited when somebody told me that I didn't sound Jamaican like their other friend. I think I was maybe 14 at the time, 13 or 14. And I was like, this is good. Because I equated that to how I could always tell when my mother was talking either to a white person or somebody that was going to hire her, which was usually the same, because she talked different. She talked better. And how I was getting into that too. And how when my daughters who were born in the US, and to a mama who sounded also like she was born in the US, didn't have any of those issues, how I was excited when people would say that Marley was eloquent or that Sage spoke well or did a thing or whatever, and how much studenthood I had piled in front of actual Marley and actual Sage, so that when they talked to me, by the time I got to the layer of them, it was so diminished. It was like a copy of 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 a copy through the lens of what their teacher said they were doing or not doing. So I didn't even know who they were. So how could I support what I don't even understand? I don't support it. I use fear-based tactics to control it, like we do with each other, right? Like we do, I work oftentimes with groups who are trying to bring other groups, marginalized groups, into their spaces, but they don't know how. It's like, look, we have a school. Yes, we're in a city that's predominantly white, and yes, blah, blah, blah. But we're open, but nobody comes. Why? I had a similar experience as a parent. I'm a good parent and I did all the things. Why don't you want to like sit and talk to me about your life? Why don't you let me help you? Right? Come to find out, because I was not trustworthy. And a lot of us as adults are not because not because we're bad people or we hate children or whatever. It's not those reasons. We do not have language and practice for being in actual partnership. What we have is a colonizer mindset, a colonial mindset about power and the opportunity for them to emerge and become, and for this land to really live up to its potential with my guidance and my control and my sense of responsibility and my prayer and love. Right? I'm gonna take a second because we only have about 20 more minutes together. And I want to invite, and also I also feel really clear that we are in conversation, because I can see and connect and feel, right? As we decolonize, we're also decolonizing out of the idea that words are the way that we communicate best. That is also from pervasive whiteness. I can sit here and feel, I can see as Richard is doing this, that he's thinking through some things that are showing up, right? I can see these things. I can feel, even if somebody's thing is not up, I can tap into a feeling and trust that in the moment. Intuition, the crazy woo-woo things that we don't get to talk about in schoolish spaces that are very real and valuable, and that we can reintegrate into our norms and rehumanize our relationships, particularly our intergenerational ones. So right now, if anyone does want to communicate with words in the form of a question or a statement of any kind, please unmute yourself and do so.
Something Akilah said earlier, it's not super related, but I'd like to talk about like the intersections between anxiety and how society perceives young people. I have an anxiety disorder, so I get panic attacks a lot. And the first time I had a panic attack, my parents were scared and they didn't know what was going on because at the time they didn't know what panic attack, well, they like knew what panic attacks were, but they didn't have the experience with them. And they thought I was just having a tantrum and ended up hitting me. And if I remember correctly, my mom did apologize when she realized what was actually going on. But yeah, just the way our culture treats people with mental health issues and acts as though it's a character flaw rather than a disability.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. Yes, Catherine, thank you very much for that. That is one of, it feels very personal. I can definitely connect to what you're saying, even outside of like the human element of it, because Sage, our youngest, and we've both talked about this publicly, so I know she's comfortable with me sharing that. My learning curve, like your parents, I didn't get to the point of hitting, but all the same, I viewed her reaction to things as like a tantrum or like extra, you know, like something that really was about my lack of knowledge and understanding. And as an adult, I didn't need to understand because I was in the position of power. So whatever I thought from my limited perspective was law. That's what was going on. And it took the process of, I talk about that in the book in detail too, how I took Sage to a yoga class when she was maybe about, I don't know, maybe 5. And at the time she was a self-professed yoga lover. And I have YouTube videos of her, you know, doing asanas and reviewing yoga videos. And she gave me permission. It was the dinosaur thing again. I'm like, bet, you all about yoga, let's do it. So I booked the class, you know, and I think she even said yes to that class. But that day we got to the class and she didn't want to do it. She didn't want to do it. And Catherine, she asserted that no. She said no over and over and had her whole body wrapped around my leg. And I moved her off and was basically like, you don't get this yoga work because you said you're into this and it's wonderful and it's for moms and kids. Here we are, moms and kids, you're going to do it. And just push, 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 push. And that I learned over time was a form of violence against her. The same way if somebody makes me do something that I do not want to do, particularly if it's somebody who holds a position of power over me, whether they pay my check, you know, like they pay me a check or they have something to do with my livelihood or whatever in any way, just like in the position of me and Sage, they make you do something that is a form of violence. And it took over the years me learning how to listen, Catherine, and how to disrupt my ideas of what I knew, right? To hear when Sage said, that's not what this is. And also to make room for her to not need to articulate in the middle of a freaking panic attack in order for me to honor that something was happening that I didn't need to try to fix, but that I could still support. And that I didn't need to understand it in order for it to be like valid and legitimate, and that I could get more information to learn how to, you know, like support her in it better. So like those are some of the things that I can offer in terms of parents who might think like I thought that my kid was being extra, or that this was an opportunity, a teachable moment. We do that a lot as adults. Oh, okay, you know, you can't just react like this, so let me try to show you, you know, let me give you a softer version of this thing, or tell you what society is gonna, all of these things that feel legitimate, that are violent, and then make us less trustworthy. And then we turn around and say that children are this and that teenagers are this and that. We have all this language and all of these ideas that never turn the mirror back to say, well, but why? Why doesn't my child want to talk to me about this thing, or my student, or this student in this environment? Why don't they trust that when they say, I am this, not that I'm going to honor that? Because that's been my pattern. Or the people who look just like me as other adults, that's been our pattern. How do I listen? How do I listen even when I don't understand? Right? These are some of the ways that we can not weaponize our feelings and lack of knowledge. And so thank you very much, Catherine, because you are spot on in that being a reality, that adults in our society, that's what we do. We make the problem the thing that's happening, right? And that we don't understand it. That's the problem. Something's happening and I don't understand it. Let me try to control it. We make that the issue. Yeah. Anything else? And that felt very related, because this is what we're talking about now. Like, what are some of the ways that we get in the way of a young person's right to self-actualize, to self-identify, to be a part of society, to be a citizen, in a way that is making sense for them. Naira is talking about voting and medical rights. Marley has made me aware of so many things that I didn't even think about, let alone understand, when it comes to medical rights and young people. Yeah, like we're having a lot of uprisings right now that are tied to race, and that are tied to the need for us to better understand how to survive, because I think our planet will. It's just us that I'm not sure about. Like, we're in these conversations, we're talking about crisis schooling because of COVID. What we have here are opportunities to reimagine together power, to look at what it means to be in community, to develop better listening ears, a disruptive ear, a listening ear, as my friend Malika Diggs of Eclectic Learning Network and I talk about all the time. How do we disrupt these patterns of adulthood being this dominant idea that really, that's when we start to respect people, when they become adults. And then by then, our idea of respect is so warped, because we ourselves also as children were not respected, that we perpetuate a thing that continues to bring up these very same issues that we then sit and get further degrees and details about how to resolve. And that ain't it. That's not how we do it. We do it as humans together, right? Yes, yes, yes. And thank you, Catherine. Yes, of course, it made sense. And a lot of us can relate. I'm looking at Catherine's response in the chat. Yeah. And thank you very much for just like taking a moment to figure out what you shared with us. Yes, and Sebastian is echoing that sentiment. Anyone else want to speak to anything that is present as you're listening and feeling through anything here? You can say it, and you can also put it in the chat, and I'm happy to read it. You can also direct something to me specifically in the chat if you'd like to. Yeah.
I have something. You mentioned earlier on your experience with your mother when you went into a bank, as people of color, and how much of the punitive nature, I guess, of some parenting, I guess, is kind of encouraged, kind of sort of by kind of a white supremacist mindset that you need to, that you're under kind of under sort of a sort of pressure to to perform kind of for white people. It brought back a memory for me of my grandmother who was white. She was a white 1950s housewife. She told me a story one time of a Black family she had known a long time before then, who I think had gone to our church. And I think she talked it in this like very like kind of approving sort of tone, like yeah, those parents always made sure that those kids, they always behaved. You would see them saying like, "Don't let me catch you with that shirt untucked." And she was saying this with a tone of like, good for them, making sure that they're presentable.
Yeah.
And looking back, it's like, yep, it's a white lady saying, good on these Black people for behaving for me.
Yeah.
So it's like I'm cringing, of course, because I see I mean,
Yeah. And she was coming from a good place. It was like her observation, right, of them doing something right. And thank you very much for that, Katrina, because that very same thing, it's interesting, the parallels. A lot of what I talk about are those intersections and parallels, because you could see that, and you could, of course, many of us can see that parallel in the adult child dynamic as well. It shows up across the racial lines because it's about control and about respectability politics, and the idea that if you are trying to assimilate, to appease, in this case, whiteness, then you are safe, you're less dangerous. So as a child, if you are performing to appease and assimilate to your eventual good adulthoodness, then you're safe, you're in line, you're in your place. But don't step outside of that, then
yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for that. It is, I'm glad that memory came up, because again, for somebody in this room, it's going to bring something up for us to say, oh yeah, and maybe even bring it in, right? Let's bring it up and bring it in. How do I participate in that as well? That's why my tagline, it sounds good, and I'm glad it sounds good, but it came from my own deep repeated inquiry and realization that I couldn't keep using tools of oppression and expect to raise free people. Like, I couldn't say, good, Marley, good, Sage, look at how you expressed your opinion to me about this thing that I did, but you didn't do it in a way that I found rude. No, that was good. Look at you being respectful. What? How is that liberatory? And not to say they need to act like they crazy. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But it's not freedom when it's under my control. It isn't about them assimilating to a thing. Show your feelings and trust that we're going to be in a relationship where my power over and my physical capacity to control you is not what I'm going to use because you showed me a part of your human self.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. Yes, you're welcome. And thank you too. Yeah, I encourage y'all to look back at those, y'all. Like, think about grandma, think about grandpa, think about all of the ways that you may have gotten that nod of approval around like assimilation and pervasive whiteness and childism, adultism, whichever term makes sense for you. Think about the ways that those things have been such a normal part of your upbringing, from people you love, from you even. I recognize and talk about in my book and on the podcast, a lot of the people who share stories, we talk about that. Like, it's not even that complicated. We're talking about human to human relationships. We're talking about, I say oftentimes, if your partner or another adult could say or do these things, or you could do or say these things to them, and it would be a problem if you did, it should be the same for a young person. It shouldn't matter that Richard could physically make me not do something, which is why I wouldn't talk to him like I was crazy. But Margin, I'm not sure, maybe I could, so I could talk to her any kind of way, right? Like, little things like that we need as adults because we are not there yet. Because oppression and control and coercion, due primarily to pervasive whiteness and schoolishness, these are normal. These are the two legs that you and I walk around with every day. And if we are not intentional, and if we are not doing things like being in these sorts of communities where we're informed by the work of young people and the voice of young people, then nothing will change. Young people will perform for us like I used to do as a young person. I was the best. Couldn't tell me I wasn't doing everything you said I was supposed to be doing, right? But all these skills were lacking, all this pain, all this struggle. Other young people in my life that I labeled as a young person, I labeled them in all these horrible ways that I now understand as an adult. Oh, she might have been doing this. I don't know for sure, but I definitely can put that together from my knowledge now from being in community with young people and surviving my own childhood in many ways, to recognize that what I was seeing, a bully, a this or that, was somebody who was in a position where power over them was showing up as a violence, and that they were trying to work through that at the expense of the communities they were in, like a lot of the adults we're around now, like the adult we might be in an environment among other adults because we do not have this language and practice. That's what I want us to be thinking about and acting in accordance to in terms of who we're listening to when we apologize as an adult. Catherine talked about, or as adults, Catherine talked about her mom apologizing later, which, okay, good. And hopefully that also meant change. But for many of us, again, in my British Caribbean upbringing, apologize to a picnic, to a child, what? That's absurd, right? I challenge you to bring that into your circles. Did you apologize when such and such happened? Say that to another adult about a child. Tell another adult about a time you apologized to a child. Make that normal. Apologize and sit there, like I do with Marley and Sage, so that they can tell you how that shit made them feel and why it's not okay, so you could be with it. The same way we talk about when we talk about racial justice work and being in community and being able to listen to a Black person tell you why what you're doing is absurd and that you don't need to understand why to change it. We're talking about a lot of similar things that show up different ways because many of them are rooted in pervasive whiteness and the myth of white supremacy and schoolishness. And the way we navigate those things are with this sort of decolonization work, by getting involved in these issues that Naira is bringing forward and saying, yeah, but if voting age is lower, what about this? And then not turning that into a weapon to then push to say, nah, it probably needs to be 18 or 21. But instead to say, let me get into a space where I can hear what's happening here, where I can learn what I don't understand so that I can be like in partnership with young people. Not that I need to agree, but that I can get into a space where I don't feel like because I don't understand that I'm gonna push back and get in the way and use my power in a way that is not useful for our collective growth. We have a couple of minutes left and I wanna read something here, a couple of things here in the chat. Yes, disability rights. Oh my God, so much goodness in the chat. I'm gonna read these two. Bria has a question and I'm gonna get to that, but before that, I'm gonna read Logan's comment, just because of time. Logan says, a quote from a friend, a quote that a friend shared with me recently. The difficulty of imagining society without schools as they currently are is the difficulty of having been normalized as a school child, of having a subjectivity colonized by concern. Okay, having a subject, I think, colonized by concern to be able to do something, of having been constantly examined to prove that one can get to the point, yes, make the point, or draw the picture of the alternative. The fact that I cannot answer my own wish for an alternative, that I fail to conceptualize, yes, a solid vision of something better after laying out a range of problems, the inability in apparently satisfying way of proposing something better is itself an entrapment in the very limits of discourse on ability and betterness that is being rethought. That's from The Hunt for Disability. Love that, right? And that, I so relate to that. That to me is, again, moving away from the myth of pervasive whiteness into what I understand as more African-centered ways, where we're not talking about what is the solution or the 3-point step. We're saying, let's be together and trust the intelligence of the collective, the emergence of things seen and unseen getting together to work through a thing, that the articulate person is not necessarily the person with the answer, that we don't need a charismatic leader. We need to know how to be in community and talk to each other, right? And so because we're at 3:30, I'm gonna encourage you, and I know that Margin recorded this, and I hope that we can also get the chat, I'm not sure, but oftentimes with Zoom, we can get the chat as well. So I'm gonna just direct folks there. Bria, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to answer your question. Thank you for it. I know you understand as you do these things too. But I appreciate y'all. I wanna respect your time. Thank you so much for your presence. And please treat this as the urgency that it is, an opportunity for us to evolve, not just imagine differently, but to start to practice outside of the oppression that has been normalized, because that shit is not sustainable, as we can see. Okay? Thank y'all so much for your time.
Thank you, Akilah. This was
You're so welcome.
amazing. Yes.
Thank you, Akilah.
Thank you.
Welcome. Peace and love.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.